Yo guys, what's up? Bursinator here. We've got a lot of great topics to cover this week. They're all revolving around a specific overarching topic that I really want to talk about, and that's the difference between strength and muscle. Specifically, we're talking about strength gain and muscle gain, the neural factors versus the muscular factors, how these things differ, and how they all combine and everything like that. So we're going to start this week. We got 3 videos coming, and then I got a blog as well. And all these are going to be incorporated in it. So today, I wanted to start off by kind of going with the opposite of what most people usually would train for. So most people are usually training for either a combination of strength and growth, or even just growth, because they just want to, put on that muscle, look a little bit better, and all that good stuff. Now, obviously, if you're a strength athlete, then this is not necessarily for you, because you probably are trying to train for just strength. But if we look at the opposite goal, just training for strength, trying to limit growth as much as possible, it's going to shed a lot of light on a lot of the things that will help the growth, and kind of show us the differences, so we can kind of split them up and see exactly what we need to do here. So before we dive into actually what would cause strength gain without the muscle growth, let's kind of break down the neural factors versus the muscular factors, because this is kind of what makes the difference between just pure strength gain or just muscle gain. So when it comes to the neural factors, that's what your nervous system sends electricity to your muscles to cause them to contract against the weight. So obviously that stimulates the muscle fibers to a certain extent, but there's also a few things that the nervous system does separate from the muscular system. So one of those is rate coding. Now, rate coding basically is just every time your brain sends electrical impulses to your muscles, rate coding is the rate at which they're doing it. So muscles respond to the electrical impulses through something, they have something called an action potential. And that basically is just a threshold where if you send a certain amount of electricity, then it triggers the action potential and your muscle contracts. But if you send less than it, nothing happens. If you send more than it, you get the same reaction. It's not like you get more as you send more electricity. So with these action potentials, it's basically like if you had a threshold here, and then if you send this signal, nothing, 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 and then when you get to that point, you fire. And then if you keep going higher, it's the same thing. You're still just contracting a muscle just like you normally would. And it's kind of interesting, because if you actually think about, if you let your arms just rest and you think about contracting it, but not enough to actually contract it, that's the same as sending a little bit of electricity, but not enough to trigger the action potential. But then if you actually lift it, that's when enough electricity from your brain has been sent. So that's kind of how that feels. So in order to increase the intensity, you have to increase the frequency of impulses, meaning that instead of just sending one like this, it sends it faster. And by sending it faster, it causes more muscle fibers to contract, and you lift heavier weight. So that's rate coding. The other big neural factor is coordination. That's simply coordination between the muscle, coordination between the individual motor units in the muscle. So that means that instead of, if you want to contract a muscle, instead of this firing and then this firing and then this firing, if they fire together, then you're going to get stronger full muscle contraction if all the muscle fibers are acting in the same time. So that's kind of the basics of the neural side of things. Now, on the muscular side of things, we're looking at 3 main causes of muscle growth. We have tension, which is just the weight on the bar or any kind of resistance that you're working against. We have fatigue, the second one, which is basically the accumulation of, lactic acid, the other waste byproducts, and basically the general depletion of your muscles' energy stores. And then the third one is damage, or sometimes called micro damage, from the individual fibers getting torn apart. And that happens during weightlifting, specifically during the eccentric part, the lowering part. So when the weight's coming down, your muscle fibers have a lot more tears in them. So tension is the primary stimulator. Probably something like 70% of all the growth that you're going to get comes from the tension. And then probably 20% from fatigue and 10% from the damage. Now, this isn't these aren't hard numbers, it's just kind of an estimate somewhere around that range. The point is that tension's the big one, then fatigue, and then micro damage. All right, so with those 2 things out of the way now, we can talk about exactly how you would train for strength and limit your amount of muscle growth. So the big thing is that, of the 3 factors for growth, for the tension, fatigue, and micro damage, Tension, it's inevitable. If you're going to be lifting heavier weights, you're going to be lifting with against more tension, against more weight. So there's not much we can do about that as far as limiting the amount of tension. But we can limit the fatigue and we can limit the micro damage. So the way we do that is fatigue mostly happens towards the end of a set when you're pushing a set towards failure, and when you're doing a lot of total volume. So the two first things we need to do is make sure you stay far away from failure and make sure you limit your total volume. Total volume meaning more of the total amount of reps you're doing, not necessarily the number of sets. If you're lifting a lot of sets for very low reps, then you won't accumulate a ton of volume even if you end up doing a lot of individual working sets. So now to limit the second factor, the micro damage. In order to limit that, like I said, micro damage mostly happens, or the primary stimulus for that damage is the eccentric, that lowering portion of the rep. So if you minimize the amount of time or the amount of tension that you're placing on the muscles during the eccentric, then you can minimize the micro damage and therefore minimize your muscle growth. So in the real world, what that would look like is basically instead of doing like the typical bodybuilder style where you lift it and then you kind of slowly lower it, you would just lower it quickly. I mean, not anything dangerous, you would just lower it at a speed that wasn't accentuating the eccentric. So it would just be like a lift and then back down. By limiting that eccentric, you're limiting the micro damage while still getting the nervous system stimulus into your muscles for the lifting. So in the real world, what does this look like? Basically, you want to be using a decent number of sets for very low reps, very far from failure, with a primary emphasis on the raising portion, the concentric portion, while minimizing the eccentric portion. So for example, a lot of guys tend to grow their legs pretty easily. And it can get to a point where maybe, proportionately they get a little bit larger than their upper body, and that's not necessarily the look they're going for. So for a lot of my clients, I'll end up having them do this kind of protocol for their legs while still getting a growth emphasis for their upper body. So for example, what they might do with the back squat, for example, which is a very big lower body mass builder kind of exercise. They would pick a weight that they could do for somewhere around 6 to 8 reps, but they would only do sets of 3. So they're very far from failure, not even getting anywhere close. As soon as they would get anywhere near failure, they would either reduce the reps to 2 or even to 1, or they would reduce the weight down, or even just terminate the entire set at that point and just say, okay, I'm done with squats for today. By doing that, again, you're limiting the fatigue and you're keeping the reps low enough that you're limiting overall work and you're limiting that failure. So by minimizing the fatigue, you're taking out one of the 3 growth factors and therefore minimizing the amount of growth you're going to get from it. Again, the second point, we talked about the micro damage. So they basically would just lower themselves quickly in the squat and then come right back up. They're not going to spend that time like slowly lowering, kind of accentuating the eccentric or anything like that. It's just a much quicker lift type of thing. So do that for anywhere from 3 to 8 sets depending on your tolerance, because you're not going to failure. You have a higher tolerance for your work sets. 8 sets of 3 sounds like a lot, but if you're staying very far away from failure, you'd be surprised you can actually get through that without killing yourself. So that's about it for how to increase your strength without increasing your growth. Again, like I said, this is something that is going to help you understand the difference between the nervous system and the muscular system, between pure strength gain and between growth. And by doing that, you're going to be able to learn a lot about what actually causes growth, what actually causes strength, and just kind of generally how your whole body works. So to recap real quick, nervous system can improve through rate coding or coordination, and that's purely your nervous system. Your muscles, if your muscles stayed the exact same size, you would still get stronger if those 2 things improved. And then on the muscular side of things, we have primarily tension, and then we have fatigue and micro damage. So tension's inevitable. You have to be lifting heavy weights to get stronger, and there's just no way around that. So in order to minimize growth, we just minimize the fatigue, which comes about from going to failure and having total volume being high. And then the micro damage, which mostly is from the lowering portion of the reps. So we minimize both of those things, we can minimize the growth. So again, a lot of clients of mine, lower bodies get too big, so we do this for things like squats. Even deadlifts can happen like this. You can still build a stronger lower body without building size. But as you can see, if size is something that you're trying to get, then you want to push that failure. You want to do a decent amount of total volume so you get the fatigue, and then you want to make sure you're still adding a decent amount of that lowering portion to get the micro damage. And of course, all of this including in the high tension, heavy lifting that you're going to be doing. So remember, this is just the first of the 3 videos, and we have a blog coming too. This is going to be a good week. There's lots of great information here. I love the topic of strength and muscle gain, and especially going into winter, a lot of people are really focused on getting that growth, getting that, getting strong, because you know, it's cold out. They can really eat a little bit more, recover a little bit better, lift a little bit harder. So I'm really excited. It's going to be great. I'll see you around. Peace.